Robyn, for being part of the symposium. What we'll do is please tell us about yourself, then I'll talk a little bit about the symposium, and then we'll take it from there. So please.
Okay. Well, my name is Robyn Short, and by way of introduction, I am a white woman of North American colonial settler descent. My ancestors came to the North American continent from Ireland and England. I was born and raised in an area of North America that's now known as Dallas, Texas. It's situated on the ancestral land of the Wichita, Caddo, Comanche, Cherokee, Kickapoo, and Tawakoni nations. I'm joining this symposium today from an area of North America now known as Wisconsin. And Wisconsin is the ancestral land of the Brothertown, the Potawatomi, the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Stockbridge Munsee, the Mohican, the Oneida, and the Chippewa nations, and of course, other Indigenous people whose names we no longer know. I work as a mediator. My work as a mediator has led me to Rwanda, where I had the opportunity to participate in some restorative dialogue circles and practices and leadership training with government officials and nonprofit organizations that are doing some really deep and systemic work to support a culture of peace in Rwanda. I've also done significant restorative justice work in Texas prisons, and I bring transformative mediation and restorative practices and dialogue to the United States workplace, where I do a significant amount of work and try to bring as much restorative practices as possible to both culture development and leadership training. I also work locally in the Texas area, supporting nonprofit organizations in creating systemic change to ensure they are really highly focused on creating racially equitable workplaces. I'm coming today not necessarily to bring expertise in Indigenous culture, but really to talk about how those of us who have practiced or are practicing mediation in Western influenced cultures or in cultures that have been influenced by colonization, how white supremacy culture has really embedded or infused itself into our conflict intervention practices, and how those practices can really perpetuate harm. And how without having an awareness of what these practices are and what white supremacy culture really is and what it's about, we as mediators have unconscious biases and lack of awareness of what we're bringing into the mediation process. So I want to start first with some definitions around colonization and decolonization. At a academic or scholarly level, have always understood what colonization is, but had never come across a framework for it that helped me to be able to see colonization in a really tangible way in terms of how it's influencing day-to-day life. And in his book, Decolonizing Wealth, Edgar Villanueva puts together a simple and also some profound, I think, framework for us to think about what colonization is, and therefore what decolonization is. So very simply, colonization exists when we're in spaces that are designed to divide us, to control us, and to exploit us. And interestingly, in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, the author Remna Menskin talks about how colonization has really influenced all people around the globe, including white people, that white supremacy culture has been used as a weapon against all of us. And so this idea of really keeping our eyes out for practices or contexts that are designed to divide us from one another, to control us and to exploit us, helps us to be able to see colonization in practice and in day-to-day life and in our language and in our behaviors. So if colonization is what divides, controls, and exploits us, then decolonization is that which connects us, brings us into relationship with one another, and creates belonging. And when we reflect on what Kenneth Cloke talked about in his opening session, we can see that these indigenous practices to conflict resolution, and I'm thinking specifically around restorative practices and restorative dialogue, are designed to do just that, to bring us to create connection, to bring us back into right relationship with one another, and to create belonging. However, those of us using mediation in Western cultures, and I think also in cultures that have been historically colonized, mediation is often not a mechanism for creating connection, relationship, and belonging. It's simply a mechanism for resolving a conflict and coming to some resolution. And I have always been suspect of mediators who work in traditional mediation, facilitation mediation, who refer to themselves as peace builders simply because they're keeping people out of the court system, when their practice, in fact, does not create connection, relationship, and belonging. It simply gets us to a non-litigated resolution. And I think that's a really low bar for peace. I think peace really, in order for us to say that we're actively engaged in the work of peace, then what we're really actively engaged in is the work of decolonization. We're practicing conflict interventions that create connection, that bring us back into right relationship, and that create belonging. And the definition of belonging that really informs my work comes from the work of Peter Block. And so this idea of belonging is that we are with friends always, meaning we are with people who care about, support, and are concerned with the mutual well-being of one another, and that we're also co-creators of this thing we've come together to be in relationship around. So creating belonging as part of a conflict intervention mechanism is something that really intentionally is designed to ensure equitable access to power across all relationships, in whatever context it is that we've come together to be in relationship around. Which brings me to this idea of white supremacy culture and how it is influencing all aspects of life in predominantly white Northern European influence, like the United States and Europe, and in countries that have been influenced by colonization. And there's really four categories of white supremacy culture that I think is important for people to be aware of. And those are urgency. Interestingly, conflict avoidance. There's a great deal of conflict avoidance that goes into the conflict intervention work, paternalism, and objectivity. So we'll take a look at urgency first. In this category of urgency, there is a tendency to put task before relationship. So when we think about traditional mediation practices, very often we have people in separate rooms, and they never come together in a joint session. And the mediator is shuffling back and forth between these two rooms, hashing out some kind of negotiated agreement. There's no space at all designed for putting relationship at the center of the work. And there's a great deal of urgency in the negotiation itself. They are always pushing to get to some form of resolution. And that resolution is designed to ensure that these two people actually never come together in a relationship with one another. And when we think about how different that is, how different traditional mediation is from Indigenous practices, such as restorative justice, where the dialogue around the conflict itself would never begin before a great deal of intentionality around a relationship is first put into place. The second aspect of the category of urgency is results before process. And I think that that is an interesting concept for mediators to really reflect on, because we see ourselves as keepers of process, and as process being really the most sacred piece of the mediation, that we are responsible only for process, and that results are truly in the hands of those that are in the mediation. But if you really reflect on, when I think about mediations that I've observed, results are really what the parties and the mediator are seeking to achieve. And the process is a mechanism for those results, instead of the process really truly being the sacred piece of the mediation itself. And then inside the urgency category is also a focus on outcomes before inclusion. So always pushing for resolution instead of ensuring that all voices that are influenced by a particular conflict are represented and heard. So when we think about a restorative justice process, we're concerned with the needs of the person who has been harmed. We're concerned with the needs of the person who is responsible for the harm. And we're also equally concerned with the communities of both of those people. So that really broadens the stakeholder base. And in terms of an Indigenous process, such as restorative justice, we would always ensure that all of those voices were represented in a conflict resolution process. But very often in these white supremacy cultures, we're exclusively focused on outcomes, and we've not taken the time or the intentionality or the design to bring those many people into the room. There's also a tendency in the urgency category for there to be no space for mistakes or learning. And there's a great deal of shame that is accompanied with mistakes. And those mistakes can often be used against you in a mediation process. And a focus on quantity over quality. So urgency is a really key piece to the conflict, to the white supremacy culture piece. And I want to pause there and tell a story about a mediation that I observed that I will probably come back to a couple of times, because it was such an extreme example of white supremacy culture showing up in mediation. And I observed this mediation when I was going through my own mediation practice training, and I was in practicum. And the mediation was between a Black American man and who was coming to mediation without legal representation, and a in-house counsel for a home builder. And so the in-house counsel was there in mediation representing the home building company. This was the first home that this man had ever purchased. And it was also the first home that anyone in his entire family had ever owned. So he was going to be the first homeowner of his ancestors here in the United States. And in the United States, as probably everyone knows, there has been centuries of oppression and intentionally designed racist policies that have excluded Black Americans from access to wealth and access to purchasing a home, and all of the wealth accrual that comes with that. So his entire lived experience and all the lived experience of his ancestors had been as tenants. And the rights that come with tenants are very different than the rights that come as a home builder. And so the conflict was really situated around things he thought the home builder should be responsible for, that an actual landowner would be responsible for. But in the process of purchasing a home, it was really the responsibility of the homeowner. But he didn't understand that. And as I was observing, it was becoming really, really clear to me that there was a lack of shared knowledge about what was happening. And the mediator was a white woman, and the in-house counsel was a white woman, and they were bringing their understanding of what homeownership looks like to this process. And as the mediation went on and he became more and more frustrated and emotional and was making mistakes because he didn't understand, he didn't have the legal knowledge that the attorney had, there was a tremendous amount of urgency that was beginning to be applied to the process without there being, and he was becoming more and more alienated and separated and actually exploited in this process. So the whole framework of colonization was happening in real time while these white supremacy culture norms were being infused into the process. And something that I have observed over and over in mediation processes in Western cultures is the way the mediator has this tendency to use the court system as a weapon to push the mediation forward. So there will often be this tendency to say, well, if this were to go to trial, this is probably what a jury would decide. And it's used as a way to push the parties toward resolution, to keep them in the mediation process and to get them to resolution. But it is it hits every bucket of this culture of urgency and task before relationships and results before process and outcomes before inclusion, and infusing some fear that the parties will make a mistake and that this mistake will come back to harm them, all while the mediator is seeing themselves as a neutral third party. And these white supremacy norms really prevent us from sitting in that position of neutrality. So the second category of white supremacy culture is conflict avoidance. And I see this conflict avoidance showing up in mediation processes often, which I find interesting because as conflict engagers, we see ourselves as being skilled, capable, and willing to engage very directly in conflict. But these norms that come along with conflict avoidance are often present, such as defensiveness, difficult ideas considered threatening. When I give this talk to audiences in the United States, this talk itself causes people to experience a great deal of conflict avoidance and feeling defensive because they have the experience of being under threat or being told that their culture is in itself doing harm. But I think it's really critical when we think about who we are as mediators that we have a great deal of awareness about what we're bringing to the mediation table. And if we don't have an understanding of how white supremacy culture is really shaping our mediation process, we're unintentionally bringing a great deal of bias into the process itself that's preventing the process from being a healthy decolonized space. Conflict avoidance also comes with this idea of protecting certain people or protecting certain people's feelings. So if I go back to the mediation that I was observing with this Black American man and the white counsel, the mediator began to align herself with the white attorney, who was also a woman. They culturally had shared language. They culturally had shared understanding. They culturally, both professionally, had a deep understanding of what the mediation process looked like. And they both really understood where the power resided. And I began to observe the mediator utilizing the mediation process to protect the feelings of the white woman in-house counsel at the exclusion of the other party. And she was completely unaware of the fact that she was doing this. But it was obvious that the pressure that he was feeling was growing. And because they were using the mediation, this very traditional caucus practice of not bringing the parties together and the mediator shuffling from one room to the other, without her awareness, she was creating a really colonized space where he didn't have access to what was being shared with this other person. From a mediation perspective, the mediator wasn't doing anything unethical. from a colonized perspective, she was absolutely sustaining a very colonized space. By the way that she was managing the process, and by the way that she was really aligning herself with the attorney, because he was the person. So the next piece to this conflict avoidance is that there's no space for feelings, that we keep our feelings out of the process, which of course we all know is not possible. As this process was becoming more and more colonized, the Black American, of course, intuitively can feel that because it's the space that he has lived in the United States. And he was growing more and more emotional. And his emotions were being exploited and deepening this sense of separation instead of being used as a signal that some basic human needs and some dignity needs and some needs around peace were actually being violated. And that's something that we see all the time in white supremacy culture, is really the weaponization of our emotions and our feelings. And this shows up frequently in mediation. And then there's also in this category of conflict avoidance is control over agenda. And very often in traditional mediation practices, because the mediator sees him or herself as the keeper of process, they're also the guardian of the agenda. And there can be a tendency to not be able to be in flow with the needs of the parties, and instead being very highly controlling over the agenda, which is also a piece of white supremacy culture. So the next category that I want to share around white supremacy culture is this idea of paternalism. So paternalism shows up as control over decision making. And, again, as mediators, we see ourselves as third-party neutrals. But I recall listening to one of my mentors say, how often do the parties reach the agreement that you thought was the right idea? And she laughed and said, probably pretty often. And that means that we haven't really been operating as a third-party neutral. We've been guiding the parties in their decision-making and moving them toward the idea that we think is going to be the best idea or the right outcome. That is very much a white supremacy culture norm. And without having awareness of that norm, we'll just continue to keep that bias with us in the process. This idea of helping them is a part of paternalism that we definitely see in colonized spaces. So we divide people, we control them, we exploit them, and then we step in to help. And that sustains a power dynamic and keeps a power dynamic in place where one person always has more control than the other. The next piece of paternalism is this idea of power hoarding or power holding. And I see this power hoarding and power holding show up in mediation when we are keeping people in separate caucuses and shuffling back and forth. The mediator becomes the person who knows everything, and the parties are receiving information through the filter of this white supremacy culture that's running through the mediator without their awareness. And then intent prioritized over impact. In white supremacy culture, there's a great deal of focus on intention. So if my intention wasn't to do harm, then I'm not responsible for the impact of the harm. But what we see very much in restorative practices is that impact is everything, and impact is what we are, is what we care and have concern around. And then lastly, in this last category of white supremacy culture is this idea of objectivity. So either or thinking, it's good or it's bad, it's right or it's wrong. And again, I think this shows up a great deal in the way that the mediator is shuffling back and forth and being the filter of information for the parties and pushing them toward the agreement that they see as the best outcome. There's a prioritization of rules over experience and the written word being prioritized. And I want to focus a little bit on how white supremacy culture really prioritizes the written word over other forms of knowledge sharing. And without having awareness that this is a cultural practice, we can really alienate people in the agreement process. And here in the United States, I learned this recently and found it so astounding and sad and devastating that in the United States, many of the land treaties that were created around American Indians have been violated by the US government. And one way that the US government violates these treaties is by prioritizing the written word. And one way of doing that was that in order to prove land ownership, the American Indian nations had to present the deed to the land, this written document, which of course was culturally something that didn't exist, but a way that the United States government could weaponize this cultural norm of if it's not written, it doesn't exist. And we also see this a lot in academia, that if you don't, if it isn't scholarly, if it isn't evidence-based, isn't scientifically backed research, it isn't real. And I think mediators need to be highly aware of how this prioritization of written word is showing up in their processes, and how the prioritization of written word is showing up as systems of proof or evidencing of information, as well as what the ultimate agreement will look like. And then also in terms of objectivity, this idea of there being one right way to do things, and having a lack of curiosity and openness to multicultural processes, and suspicion of alternatives. So white supremacy culture, just to sort of summarize, is showing up as urgency, conflict avoidance, paternalism, objectivity, and many of these norms and habits and behaviors are really embedded into our mediation practices. And if we don't have awareness of how these norms are shaping and influencing our own thinking, our behaviors, the way we are norming the mediation process, we will be unintentionally perpetuating colonized spaces and colonization in our conflict intervention practices. So I really want to encourage conflict engagers, and especially conflict engagers from the United States and Western cultures and spaces where there has been a great deal of colonization, to deepen their understanding of these norms. You do not have to be a white person to be influenced by white supremacy behaviors and white supremacy culture. And to have awareness that these cultural norms are really harming all of us and preventing us from creating conflict intervention spaces that that bring us together in deep connection, that bring us together in real relationship and right relationship, and that create spaces of belonging. And I think that that's so critical, because the connection, the relationships, the ability to truly be a co-creator in a process is what makes our agreement sustainable and long-lasting. And so I'll just pause there, Vikram, and see if you have questions or thoughts about anything that you've heard today.
I think what you brought in is really interesting. I think the fact that you've brought in something which, looking at it from your side and looking at it objectively, I think that's important. I mean, that's what you've done there, which I think a lot of people might not be doing. But what I really wanted to do was one moment to take to just talk about the symposium and your thoughts on the symposium, because of the fact that the idea being abroad, indigenous peoples and mediation, what all you think we should cover and what all, your thoughts on that. So this was what we started with. I would like to do this right at the beginning, but it's, I mean, just the fact that because this was this conference in May and June, which I did, and we had a session on neurodiversity and mediation. So there was Martha, she's autistic, and she said, because she must be watching some of my things, she says, because I'm quite abrupt, it just starts off. I say, come on, let's talk about the topic. So she said, you must tell us what we are sitting here for, give a little introduction, which I was not doing. I said, let's just talk about it. So this is the symposium, the idea being obviously to look at I mean, this is broad. I don't even really want to give it a direction also. But we had the inaugural address yesterday. It's all available on YouTube. And the World Mediation Circle, I'll talk about that with you later. And so this is what the symposium is about. A little bit about what's coming up this week. Let's just have a look at this week. We have 10 speakers this week from various parts of the world. So that should be interesting to hear that. And of course, like I said, the World Mediation Circle is just I'm putting together a network of mediation circles. That means you create a mediation circle in every school, every community, and community means what? Place-based, identity-based, issue-based, anything. So that's what the focus is going to be after this. But of course, we're coming up with a symposium on colonization, decolonization, and mediation, which of course, Robyn, you have to be part of. That's, I mean, of course, a lot is overlapping. I know a lot of it is overlapping because I had a session with Helen Bishop. She's in Australia, and this was what came out, that a lot you have to talk about colonization when you talk about indigenous peoples and mediation. So, because I was trying to divide the two only because I said, let's first talk about the good things, the indigenous peoples, their methods, their practices. Let's talk about the nice things. Then we'll come, of course, on to the next stage as to what really happened and were they destroyed, what the reasons. And then after that, my decolonization, but direction I want to really take is that the process of decolonization, is it really decolonization, or is it another form of colonization in the garb of democracy or law and everything? So that part of it also will talk about in that symposium. Here also, I mean, there's not an issue if it overlaps. I mean, that's perfectly all right. But at the same time, something that you did not tell us about is about your publishing that you do. So let me just put out that people can actually go to your site. So if people just go to mediatorvikram.com, and there is a section on celebrating Ken Cloke. In that, if you go down to talking books, so there you will find a link to click here to go to your Robyn's website, which is this GoodMedia Press. And you can, I don't know whether
yes, GoodMediaPress.com.
Yeah, does that still work, that the discount thing code?
Yes, it does. Let's just say yes, and I will double check that when we disconnect, but I'm pretty confident that it does still work, and it will continue to work.
Perfect. So basically, people can get a 25% discount on that. So that's something, if you want to talk about the publishing part of it, what your thought behind that was also, Robyn, it might be nice because I'm sure you had some good thoughts as to what you were going to put out there. So anything on that also?
Sure. Yes, thank you. So I, prior to working in conflict resolution and mediation, I actually worked in marketing communications and I had a marketing communications company. We had a niche in supporting people in self-publishing their books. So I worked with business owners in publishing books, and I've always been an avid reader. I love books. In Ken's address yesterday, you saw all the books that surround him. My home actually looks exactly like that. I live in this just womb of books. I love them. So when I transitioned careers, I wanted to stay in that space, and I wanted to create a publishing company that brought peace to the world and that illuminated social justice issues, but brought solutions along with them. So it wasn't just awareness, it was now you know, and here's what you can do differently. So GoodMedia Press is really exclusively focused on publishing books that support peace and social justice, and that bring solution and tangible ways that people can be peacemakers in the world. And I started that in 2012, and have had the great honor of publishing several of Ken Cloke's books and other mediators and peace builders and social justice activists, and also produced a documentary that takes people into Texas prisons and looks at extreme forms of punishment and brings some ideas forward around how we might address wrongdoing and crime and harm differently, and also helps people to see that this traditional, and when I say traditional, I mean traditional American and Western approach to harm, really perpetuates harm in the world, and does not support growth and connection and right relationship and belonging. And there's great opportunity for change in that space. And also brings forward some ideas and some awareness about what restorative justice looks like and how that can be used as a way to really decolonize our justice processes and justice space. So yes, definitely invite people to go and check out those books and take advantage of that discount code.
Perfect. Now, what we have to do, Robyn, in the symposium is the part, of course, I put it out on my posts also, what I'm looking at as mediation. Because, of course, it's a wide area. Everyone has how they look at mediation. So what I said was, let's take the definition in the Singapore Convention. Although the Singapore Convention is looking at international commercial mediation, but I like the definition only because there was no definition as such, which is globally available, and 55 countries having signed it. And of course, large economies and everyone has signed it. So I think we looked at that as something that I thought would be an indicator as to what mediation we're looking at. Then we look at the indigenous peoples, and then I'll just talk about that. So this is what was the definition that I put out, and let's look at this only because of the broad nature of it, that irrespective of the expression used, because obviously it can be, the words can be whatever, you can call it whatever. I mean, every language will have a different name for it. And it's not that I have also a symposium which I did last year on mediation in our culture and traditions. The idea was that let's connect people to the process. They might not be familiar with the word, but they're familiar with the process. So that's why I said, okay, irrespective of the expression used, basis upon which the process is carried out. Now, this whole concept of facilitative, evaluative, narrative, transformative, all that discussion is a very theoretical discussion happening there. So it doesn't matter in the whole thing how it's done. I mean, let's not limit it to, okay, only facilitative is mediation or whatever. Let's not get into any of those arguments. Not required. Definition is nice and broad enough to cover all that. Of course, the party's word, of course, I'm looking at changing that because of, again, in the conference in May and June, we had a session with Jeannie. Works in community mediation. She said, look, the language that we've brought into mediation has come from the court system. So parties has come from there. We call them participants. I said, that's really sounded nice. I said, let's change the terminology there. Of course, she said, like things like opening statement. I mean, that comes from the court system. Let's look at orientation. So that's okay. That we still have to, I mean, the definition has parties, so I'm still using it. So important thing being, of course, the person is assisting you. The important thing being lacking the authority to impose a solution, because this part has to be distinguished even in the indigenous peoples, that there is a concept of arbitration happening there. Let's call it arbitration. So let's distinguish that from the mediation part of it. And of course, restorative practices also to be looked at as different thing. It's not, is it mediation or is not mediation? What is it? Because of the fact, the nature of it, is there a dispute that we are resolving? It's just a victim offender healing that we're doing, whatever. So please throw some light on that part of it, on the various approaches, various methods, various practices, trying to put them into, okay, this is mediation, this is that kind of practice, this is this practice. So something on that, if you want to tell us.
Sure. So I, in my work, really what mediation is for me is a process that brings people together to restore them back to a right relationship. In restorative justice, and restorative justice absolutely informs pretty much everything that I do in restorative practices. From a restorative justice perspective, a crime is the violation of a relationship. So if we just replace the word with crime with wrongdoing, right? This wrongdoing can show up in a work environment as a violation of policy. A wrongdoing can show up in a family as a violation of a family norm or a family value, or family, the normal ways that we as a family system operate. It's violations of relationships. Those things that cause us to get into conflict are violations of relationships. And those violations are showing up as violations. Those violations of relationships are behaviorally violations of basic human needs in some way, or violations of dignity needs in some way. So this conflict that has happened, something has happened that has caused me to not experience justice, or to not experience participation, or a sense of belonging or fulfillment, or to not experience cultural security or identity, et cetera. All of these various things that are encompassed in basic human needs and dignity needs. Something has been violated that has caused me to experience harm. And as humans, we do not come into this world knowing how to repair that. We have a deep ability to recognize physiologically and emotionally when wrongdoing has happened, but we don't know how to name that thing. We don't know how to use language to describe it. And so we get frustrated and we become violent, or we become unwilling to lean into a process. We become resistant. We begin to hoard things. And so the mediator is the person who has the skill to help us to bring language to that, so that we can come back together in right relationship, and ideally be able to navigate some of these conflicts on our own later, because the relationship itself has been restored. So I think about mediation as a process where a third party supports individuals in restoring relationship, so that the trust is available for us to navigate these difficulties independently.
Well, Raju, why this aspect of the dispute? Because I have tried to move away from conflict to dispute, because I want to narrow it down really, because I just feel that people experiencing resolving a dispute will help them, of course, in managing and resolving conflicts. Like Ken says that this conflict revolution. So I talk about the dispute resolution revolution, because I just feel that because there is the quantifiable aspect of the dispute, you experience, yes, we resolve this, and then what you take from that process is going to be something which will help the society in general, or you as individuals. So I'm very narrow in my approach to how I'm trying to put things together. So that is why I try to distinguish between one, mediation, and the other, the role of mediators. Mediation, yes, the dispute resolution, and then things like restorative practices or other larger role of mediators in because of their skill. So that distinguishing I do. I don't know whether you agree with me on that.
So let me comment on that, because I think that's interesting. So John Burton, who's a basic human needs scholar and international relations scholar, offers a definition that I have found very useful, that conflict management is navigating. Conflicts exist when basic human needs have been violated. So a conflict is the violation of basic human needs and our attempt at getting them met. So if we think about basic human needs as being, and I'm just going to list them off based off of John Burton's theory: justice, participation, self-fulfillment, self-esteem, identity, belonging, cultural security, safety, security, and I think that's pretty broadly these lists. I can't give you a little bit of belonging in exchange for a little bit of security. These are things that can't be negotiated. I must have all of these things because they're basic human needs, and you must have all of these things because they're basic human needs. But we can get into conflict around how I access them. So that's conflict management, the navigation of how we access our basic human needs and how we bump into each other in that process. Dispute resolution is the resolving of tangible things that we can actually parse up a little bit. So I might be having a dispute with my employer about the number of days I have off and my compensation. And they might say, well, I can give you a little bit less compensation in exchange for a little bit more days off, or vice versa. These are things that are negotiable that we can splice up. And I have found that definition helpful. What I believe, and what William Ury talks about, is that if you dig deep enough, all disputes are grounded in a conflict. So all disputes have at their core this navigation of basic human needs that we're struggling with. So if we think about the dispute resolution piece from an interest-based perspective, and we're having this dispute around things that we can tangibly negotiate, if I dig a little bit deeper, there's probably a basic human need underneath it. That's my driving interest. And there's probably a basic human need underneath it for you. That's the driving interest. And so we kind of get ourselves back into the conflict management space.
No, actually, I mean, I don't know if we are going to be able to bring it out from the symposium, is that this whole interest-based negotiation, I'm looking at values-based negotiation. I'm thinking of that humanistic approach and that. So are we getting something of that from the indigenous methods? If there is something that you have seen there, which we can maybe pick up and learn from? Because I just feel that, look, this interest-based and everything is perfectly all right. It's been spoken about, but at that aspect, the values-based and humanistic approach, and of course, again, you'll hear me say this about heart, soul, spirituality, all that, those elements as part of the process. Have you seen something there in the indigenous peoples and how they are looking at it in the mediation?
Yes. I'm thinking about, I'm going to go back to restorative practices, that it is about the connection of the whole self and our needs as spiritual people, our needs as members of communities, our needs as actual human beings, and the responsibility that we have to one another in that process, and how all of those things are interrelated. And, you know, kind of going back to white supremacy culture, in white supremacy culture, we have parsed them out and separated them and made them not connected, which is destructive and unhealthy and not natural, and a false narrative that leads to a lot of physical illness, spiritual illness, social illness, depression and anxiety. So yes, I 100% agree with that.
Yeah, because what you said is really important, because that's the symposium that I did in April on heart, soul, spirituality, and mediation. The idea was to highlight these things, because these are elements which maybe, because people cannot pinpoint, there are no specific words for certain aspect, of course, energy fields and spirituality and how the heart and soul are connected to the whole process. So maybe that's why they don't come up. And look, I mean, you'll hear me say this better. I tell you, I keep criticizing the whole concept of the training and the 40-hour factories. I have to put it across to you, because you'll, if you watch any of the things that I do, I will keep talking about it, because these elements, first of all, seem to be missing from the entire thing. And there is lots more which is happening there in the process which gets left out. And I don't want people, first of all, I mean, the whole concept of we'll make you a mediator in 40 hours. I have a problem with that, which I told you about this, that evolution of a mediator series with Ken was basically to bring that out. The person that he is because of, I mean, everything that he's gone through and how he's, the environment that he's brought up in and the experiences and everything. So let's not demean a mediator by saying we can make a mediator in a 40-hour factory. I just have a problem with that. So I'm just saying that these elements, and why the whole concept of the symposium being that there is a purer form of mediation there. Let's find out. I'm still saying, let's find out. I mean, let's talk to people from around the world, and let's bring out the core elements of that. But at the same time, being careful that, okay, this is mediation, and like I said, the whole concept of an arbitration happening there, being told what you do and not have a choice in the matter, that also to be highlighted. So let's not take it as, of course, what everyone in the indigenous people do is mediation. So trying to bring out various aspects of that also. So that's the broad idea behind this.
Yes, and mediation is a tool in this whole conflict resolution set of tools that we can bring to problem solving. It is, of all the ways that I participate in conflict intervention, mediation as a specific practice is the one I deploy least often. Not because I don't think mediation is an essential tool, it's just not the only one. And there isn't a hierarchy to all the various tools that we have to apply. But I do think that the way Western mediation has been designed, it is a space that's been highly colonized. And so if you don't have intentionality and awareness around that as a tool, it can not be as effective in reaching long-term resolution and healing. And when I was going back to your comment about making a mediator in 40 hours, I have always perceived that as really dangerous. And I remember when I was actually going through mediation training and completed my training, I did not feel at all prepared to begin mediating. And it was really concerning to me to see people that I knew coming out of that training and mediating, because I just intuitively thought we don't know enough yet to really be effective and to not do harm in this process. And I have always, as a person and as a conflict engager, been very, very interested in the resolution of the root cause to this conflict. We can keep negotiating these little bits that we keep getting in dispute around, but if we don't really get to the core of what's driving this disconnect between the two of us, the conflict will be either self-perpetuating or the resolution itself we won't experience healing in the process. And when I was going through mediation training here in the United States, I was really aware of and had curiosity about my participating students in the class having this hypersensitivity and feelings of like suspicion anytime it looked like the mediator was moving into a therapy space. Like if we talked about feelings, if we talked about spirituality, if we talked about the whole person being in the middle of this conflict, people would get real upset and triggered and accuse the person of behaving like a therapist. And it was always really concerning to me. I understand you can't practice therapy without being a therapist and that mediation isn't therapy, but to say we can't bring these really critical aspects of the human into the process is extremely alienating and ineffective. And I had the opportunity when I was a student to learn and train under Ken. And I remember Ken saying, this was actually when I was getting my doctorate, he made this statement that's very Ken Cloke. And it was, I'm making this up and you get to make it up too. And it was super liberating for me because I realized that mediation training had put everybody in this very tight box. And if you were to move out of that box, it was unethical. And I felt like the box itself was unethical. And for Ken Cloke to give me permission to open that box up and to engage with the human at the most human level, and that if Ken can do this, I can do this too. It actually was the thing that made me realize this is what I'm going to go into. Because prior to that, I kept thinking, I don't think that this is a space I can move into. But Ken giving me permission, giving all of us permission to engage with the human at a very human level was really liberating. And I remember one time sitting in a session with him at the Southern California Mediation Association conference, and someone in the room, I mean, this happens all the time here in the United States, someone in the room accused him of practicing therapy. They raised their hand and they said, that sounds like therapy. And Ken said, okay. And I was like, yes, okay. That's okay if that's what that sounds like.
No, what you just said is like, I don't take out clips from my videos, but what you said is really important. I should actually take out these 2-minute, 1-minute clips and put them out because it really summarizes what I've been talking about. And I mean, just to hear someone else also agreeing to that, it's just sounds nice because a lot of people, like you said, just have that box and that is the box. That's it. We can't go beyond that. There is nothing beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Robyn, what we need to talk
Mm-hmm.
about is, because you worked in the prison system, the aspect of that colonization and the colonizer's prison. and then comparing it to, of course, the indigenous practices. Because I have been talking about this, that just the fact that you can put someone, of course, up till the person is not convicted, he is innocent. And if putting an innocent person in that space and taking away the rights and everything, that is only a colonizer could do that. So, and just looking at it from the practices in the indigenous people, just something on that part of it.
Well, and traditional, so when we look at restorative practices and indigenous practices, they're designed to support all parties in the process in transcending the harm, in healing, and restoring right relationship with ourselves, like as the wrongdoer, with myself, right relationship with myself, and right relationship with the people who have been harmed, and right relationship with the people who have been stakeholders to this harm. And when you think about, so if you going back to what you said about only a colonizer could really do this traditional court process, if you think about the way traditional justice is designed, you come into a process that requires that you declare, I'm guilty and I'm not guilty. Those are the only two options. I'm guilty, I'm not guilty. And all of us as human beings are hardwired for self-protection. And so I know if I go in and I say I'm guilty, I am participating in my own punishment. And this punishment is intensely harmful, right? This punishment's going to separate me from loved ones, and it's going to separate me from the vast majority of my basic human needs. There's nothing more cruel than prison, and there's no possible way to thrive in that environment. So therefore, as the wrongdoer, I come into this process and I tell a lie, and I say I'm not guilty, because that's the only way for me to preserve my own livelihood. So a process that begins with a lie, and a process that begins with the assumption that the lie is okay because it's a part of the process. Like nobody believes that the person is not guilty when they say they're not guilty. It's just a lie that's become acceptable. And those things harm us, right? When I am not living honestly with myself, I'm doing self-harm. And it also harms the other people who are participating. So from its inception, from the process's inception, is causing us to separate from one another and causing us to create separation from ourselves. And it sustains this sense of control and exploitation. And the ability to heal and transcend from that only comes from some other form of intervention. So these people go into prison, through this process, they ultimately, prison is usually the ultimate destination place. And the ability to actually then transcend this and heal is coming from some other intervention, a nonprofit that's entered into the space, books the person has the opportunity to consume, but some other form of intervention is having to override the justice system in order for the healing to actually take place. And the ability for those two people to come together never happens. And in most states here in the United States is illegal to even happen.
Because I'm telling you, when I look at the whole concept of a prison, a whole system there which came up hundreds of years back, and the whole understanding of the human brain has changed over that, and how you can actually, in terms of a person themselves changing and their thought process and everything, those not being looked at as being the right direction to go in. I still feel that, I don't know, again, this whole colonizer aspect of it, which we'll take up in that symposium also, because what you spoke about, the fact that mediation and settling because of the court and the amount of time it'll take and the cost still which you'll have to incur, because of that you should settle. And that kind of deal making, that's not the kind of mediation that I want to promote. The mediation has to be based on other factors, where you have to want to collaborate, you want to understand the other person. Again, like I keep saying, I'll be repeating myself, you'll hear this, the humanistic approach, the values based aspect of it. So I think what you're saying is exactly what we tried to put across, that is not the mediation that we want to promote. It's because it's not giving giving the user the experience that we would want them to have. So they're not taking it back. So mediation doesn't develop the way it should develop. Still, that whole concept of dispute resolution happens in courts. So people will come into court and they'll have this experience where a gun will be put on their head and the costs will be the factor. Okay, this is a gamble. Let me not go through with this. Although I know that, okay, I want someone to decide for me, whatever the reasons for that are. I mean, that's how their reasons, but I'm going to settle it for these reasons because of the, like I said, cost and everything. So I think that's not the mediation we really want to. I mean, I don't want to, and I can understand from what you're saying, you also don't want that to happen. So we have to find the ways to bring that out, that there is lots more. So there's more on that you want to tell us about. What your thoughts on that will be important.
Well, it just makes me think about how important these conversations about colonization are, because until we actively, intentionally, thoroughly go through decolonization processes in all aspects of society, but also within our own internal mindsets, we will continue to produce colonized outcomes. In his book, Decolonizing Wealth, Edgar Villanueva refers to colonization as a virus, that like a virus, it infuses all aspects of a body and makes all aspects of the body sick. And we need a antiviral process to really eradicate this colonized virus from our collective system, so that decolonized conflict resolution processes look normal. Like when you think about a restorative justice process or a restorative dialogue, how powerful those are in supporting us in reconnecting with ourselves and reconnecting with others. And yet those are perceived as radical or outliers when they should be perceived as the most normal way to metabolize a conflict. But it's because we've been so deeply ingrained in this colonizer mindset that we can only see colonized processes and colonized outcomes.
Yeah, this whole conditioning of the mind. So, I mean, look, you're just saying exactly what I've been talking about, and that's why that symposium is important. So, Robyn, what you have to do is you have to get in more people, like you, of course, Farzin, you have referred. Let's get in more voices, which, of course, you know more about who those people are going to be. Let's reach out to them. Let's bring those voices in, because I'm saying that's going to be a very important part in that what direction we want mediation to take. But do you want to touch upon Rwanda? Is there anything from there you want to tell us? Yeah,
well, sure. So when I was thinking about this conversation and I was thinking about my experience in Rwanda, countries like Rwanda who have experienced great harm often are inundated with outside influence coming in to bring their remedy. And when I was working in Rwanda, there were so many nonprofit organizations, including the nonprofit organization that brought me over, that were really bringing colonizer solutions to the harm. And I was observing the resistance to it, the politeness to the individual who was coming and being generous with the gift that they had to give, but resistance to the process that was being offered, and that those processes weren't meeting the need. And what I would do, so I was with this organization that I think was bringing a lot of colonized processes as the solution. And when that doesn't work, it leaves the person who's on the receiving end potentially feeling more broken, because this solution didn't achieve the healing. It didn't achieve the transcending that it was designed to do. And because restorative practices influence everything that I do, I brought people together in circle and designed those circles to be healing circles. And it was, from my perspective, I think this humanistic approach that we've been discussing and these restorative practices that we've been discussing are the most human things that we can do. So therefore, there's nothing particularly astounding to me about it. It's humans coming together with humans and really connecting in deep ways. And the feedback that I got from the dialogue circles that I led was, this was the most healing experience that I've had in the 20 years since the genocide. And it made me feel really sad at a deep level, because it's simple. It's a simple solution. And it should be offered all the time. It's what we should all be leading with. But so much of the solutions that are coming and were coming to these people who have been deeply harmed were perpetuating the harm and stunting the healing process, because they were coming from a colonizer mindset, even though they were coming with the very best of intentions, right? The people coming were bringing all their love and all their best intention and all their wisdom and their knowledge, but all of that was coming from a colonizer mindset and a colonizer understanding of how you manage and transcend conflict. And so I just think it's deeply important for people who are investing themselves in this conflict intervention space that they lean into these ancient and indigenous practices, because they are designed to really bring the whole person into the process. And colonization has conditioned us to be very, very fragmented and to only bring pieces of ourselves. We see it in Western medicine. You know, when I go to my doctor for a particular issue, they see me only as the organ that is sick, or the body part that is sick. They don't see me as a whole person, and this symptom is coming through this particular part of my body. And we need to see our conflict resolution spaces in that same way, extremely holistically, in order to truly heal.
I think that's an interest. Though that analogy, I think that's important. I think the natural cure for the body and for disputes, and compared to, like you said, modern science and modern medicine on this end, and of course the court system and that aspect of dispute resolution on the other. I think Robyn, you need to write something on this, comparing this and putting it together. So this is an important, I think this is important, because I think where I give this analogy where we talk about the aspect of the courts talking about mediation, and the fact that mediation is part of the court system. And of course, in some places like, say, India, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court sets up a committee to draft a law on mediation. And I keep saying, what do you have to do with mediation? It's a different process. It is not connected to you. And that's why the analogy that, look, you have modern medicine, allopathic concept, allopathic doctors sitting, and we will regulate Ayurveda. I think that's what you're trying to do. Ayurveda is a different process altogether. Do not try to bring in your thoughts on that into this aspect. So that's an analogy, and here, of course, you're also giving that. So this is, I think, at this, I mean, look, I have enough time. I don't know about you. So if there is something that you want to take us through in terms of course, your thoughts on how any changes that you think, some model, I don't know whether you want to call it a model, but some things that you have thought about as to what steps should be taken in relation to even the laws and the other practices. So you want to give us some larger picture on that?
Yeah, so here's what's coming to mind for me as it relates to this humanistic approach to conflict resolution. Colonization. So coming back to this idea that colonization separates us, controls us, exploits us. It does that to us internally as well. It separates us from ourselves. It separates my thinking from my feeling, and my ability to energetically pick up on what's happening in the room around me. So when I teach in conflict resolution programs in graduate school, and when I teach and when I facilitate, when I'm with a body of people, I'm listening with my whole body. And so what I mean by that is I'm listening with my ears, I'm listening with my eyes, but I'm also listening with my nervous system. And I'm picking up on what's happening energetically in the room. So I can tell when someone's having a response to something that's happening in the room because I can feel it, or I see a subtle shift in their body. And so when we think about this concept of decolonizing our mediation practices or our conflict intervention practices, we have to be as conflict engagers, as third-party people, as facilitators, we have to be really energetically open to what's happening around us, or we're going to miss a lot of information. If the only thing that I rely on is what I hear, I'm going to pick up on just a tiny bit of information. I need to be able to listen with my whole body. And that means I have to decolonize my body itself. And I have to be able to be and function as a whole person, emotionally, physiologically, spiritually. And that means I need practices that help me build that ability to do that. And one of the things that I believe should be essential training for conflict engagers is mindfulness practices and developing a mindfulness meditation practice. It has been, I think a lot of mediators have or should have, I think, some sort of ritual that they go through when they come into a space. I used to, before I developed a mindfulness practice, I used to have a ritual that I went through that allowed me to come into a space of deep conflict and not absorb it, not carry it with me, not hold it. And in my mind at that time, I was keeping myself safe from the difficult emotions that would impact me, as an empathic person. But what I was also doing is closing myself off from the wholeness of who everybody was. And that meant I couldn't listen with my whole body. And that meant I was missing information that was going to be really critical to their ability to transcend the conflict. So I think what's really critical and deeply missing from these training programs that mediators go through is a practice of mindfulness that doesn't close them off, but makes them widely open to what's happening in the room, but open from the perspective of it comes through me. It doesn't come into me. It just comes through me. And only through that process do you become, as a mediator, like physiologically available to everything that's present, which is really critical to supporting them in truly transcending the conflict and healing from it, because it's giving you the capacity to actually have access to everything that's happening. And I don't really know of any mediation program that is infusing that level of training into it. And I think it's pretty important.
It's very important. I think this aspect, like you said, not just hearing from your ear. So that back to that symposium that I'm talking about, heart, soul, spirituality, and mediation, is listening from the heart to the heart, listening to the soul, connecting to the soul. I mean, there's lots more which really is happening and should happen. And like you said, that part is not really ever discussed. So that's important. I think I think we're talking about something which I think, Robyn, you have to write about. I don't write. I don't read books. I'm quite illiterate that way. So of course you need to put this out on, like you said, some people like it on paper. They want to. I think these things should be out there.
Yeah.
What I'm thinking actually of doing is
and this idea of go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, I was just thinking that now what I'm thinking of doing is that all these symposia that I have, I think I'm going to put all those sessions. I'm trying to tell someone to maybe take up the transcript from YouTube and trying to put them into a form which is a written form, which people might actually read more than listening to, because these are long sessions and everything. So maybe I think it needs to go out. I think that's what we're going to do. Yeah. So you were saying something, please.
That's a good idea. Well, I just think that going back to this idea of being able to listen with your whole body, I have never, as a mediator, designed mediations with a caucus perspective, that the parties are going to stay, the participants are going to stay in separate rooms, and I'm going to shuffle back and forth. And that design really, I think, is detrimental to the individual's ability. It's a very colonized process, and it's detrimental to the individual's abilities to really develop connection and relate to one another at a human level, and to have that heart and mind experience that you're talking about. I did a restorative justice process for a multi-party process for an organization, and I prepared all of the parties. One of it was a labor union and an organizational leader, and I prepared the parties. We are not going to go into caucus. This is going to be a joint session the whole time. I need you to stay in. If we need to take breaks or sit in silence, we can do that, but we need to stay together. 4 minutes into the process, they started caucusing, and they ultimately got some tangible outcomes, but the restoration that they were looking for, it didn't happen, because it can't happen if you can't be present with one another. And in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, the author, Resmaa Menakem, he refers to this as clean pain. It's painful, but the only way through it is through it. And I think sometimes as humans, we want to hold on to the pain, which he calls dirty pain. I want to use this pain as a source for me to stay angry and fight. And I think this caucusing process is really, it prevents us from being in that clean pain of moving through it and actually getting to the other side, which is where the healing is.
Yeah. So I think this needs to be brought out. What I'm thinking now is, because this World Mediation Circle that I'm trying to put together, I'm just telling people that identify those people with the mediator mindset in schools, in communities, in families. Let's bring them out. And what I'm thinking now is to put together a structured skill development program, because I've been doing all these various things and all these elements have been discussed. Put together a structured skill development program. And I was talking to Ken about it also, but we couldn't talk too much about it because obviously yesterday that session has to happen. But take each of these aspects and actually let that be look, I don't like this whole concept of training and everything, because that's why I'm saying skill development, because they have the skill. It's just to be able to take it further. So all this aspect will bring in that. And Robyn, you'll have to also, you'll have to give a session on that as part of that whole program, to bring these things that you brought out, because it's right now, it's here, it's available here, but it's going to be lost in the larger symposium. So that's why I think I think everyone, I think, also needs a structured program, but this will be only for the people who are part of that World Mediation Circle, because what I realized is there is so much free content available on my YouTube channel. I think people don't appreciate free. I think they have to be a more exclusive thing that they're part of, and then they'll listen to all that. That's because, look, they're almost, I think now there'll be about almost 380 videos there, and the best in the world talking about all these topics, I think gets lost there because it's available to you. You can just log in and you can watch it. It gets lost. So now, I mean, of course, it's not that I'm asking for a payment for that, but I'm trying to put together a system where, okay, you send me a gift if you appreciate the work I'm doing, and then you are part of it. So I'm just creating an entry level thing. So those people will be the people whom we have to bring together and take them through these whatever thoughts and, of course, learnings that they can get from this approach. So I think what I've understood is this approach is available. There are people like me, people like you, who are also thinking in the same way. I think we can put together a good program. I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Yep. I think that sounds like a great idea.
So Robyn, on a closing remark kind of thing, do you want a wrapping up kind of thing on this?
Well, just thank you so much for having me, Vikram, to this space. Thank you for the generosity of time that you have in bringing everyone together and making these conversations available, and for bringing this topic up. I think this topic of colonization and decolonization is really critical, and it is a space that I know as a white person, and in the white spaces that I've been in, it's not a topic that people are aware of, that people are thinking about. They don't see themselves as colonizers. They don't have a framework for applying their behavior, kind of thinking through. And that lack of awareness and knowledge sustains the harm that comes from it. So I just want to thank you so much for bringing this conversation forward and making it available to people, and including me in it.
Thank you very much, Robyn. It was really nice listening to you. And actually, I feel really nice when someone is saying all the things that I keep talking about. Sometimes I feel, am I the only one who's talking about it? But now it's nice to see that there are other people who think on the same way. But on the symposium on colonization,
Yes.
decolonization, and mediation in September, we have to fix a time for you on that. And please think of all the people we can bring into that. I think that conversation is really, really important. So thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
of course, we'll see you. Please
Thank
drop
you.
into other sessions. Let me just stop the recording here and the live stream.